Greetings and welcome to this New Year's edition of the Pandemic Podcast, a New Year message on the Pandemic Podcast. Happy New Year, firstly. I hope you enjoyed the celebrations. I hope you had a wonderful evening last night, seeing in 2022. The thing about New Year's Eve is it's always the passage of time continues. As the clock ticks and hits 12 o'clock and the calendar moves on to a new year, time goes on and nothing ever really changes in that moment. However, it is a bookmark, if you will, a snapshot, a window of time which captures the essence of what has gone before and what lies ahead, and gives us all the opportunity to author a new chapter and move forward and make changes as a result of that symbolic moment in time. So in this brief episode tonight, I wanted to briefly summarize some of the absurdity of 2021. We won't dwell upon that because, like many of us, I'm sure you're more than happy to leave some of that nonsense, if not all of it, back in 2021, and how much will how much will continue into 2022 is yet to be seen, but early evidence suggests the absurdity continues. As I mentioned, as the clock ticks, the change in the calendar doesn't change human behavior, but it does give us an opportunity for a fresh start. So in 2021, casting our minds back, this time last year, about to go into lockdowns, England was in lockdown until April last year. We had this irreversible roadmap that nearly became reversible in the build-up to Christmas this year, with the threat of lockdowns again. That lingering threat, by the way, it seems to have not. And I'm sorry to begin this broadcast with that negativity, but to very briefly summarize some of the things that we've seen in the last year. We also saw the proliferation of the vaccine rollout campaign, not only just in England, but around the world. England was one of the first to start the campaign. But ironically, during 2021, we've seen more cases, hospitalizations, and deaths in the presence of vaccines than we did in the year prior to that. And that isn't misinformation or disinformation. That is fact. You can just go on to the government's own website and look at that data and verify that for yourselves. But we've also seen a continued, despite this illusory savior, we've seen the essentially the rise of a more authoritarian and despotic response to the pandemic. It's almost as though since the vaccines were rolled out, the world got crazier. But I was reflecting this morning on all of this and everything that happened in 2021 and 2020, of course. And what strikes me is the level and the depth of corruption that underpins, and human greed, quite frankly, that underpins what has been happening in the last 2 years. There's still a lot of people out there who aren't grasping this situation and have deeply fallen into cognitive dissonance, and given the fact they've acted in accordance with that dissonance for so long now on repeat with intensity, it's likely become a identity level shift inside of them, which, even though we're starting to see the walls of the narrative collapse and crumble, the floor of such, the ground and the foundations of this are still intact, but the walls are beginning to fall. People will still hold on tightly to their pre-existing beliefs about what's happened. But that said, that middle 40% that Professor Matthias Desmet spoke about on the podcast recently is beginning to turn. The interviews that Joe Rogan has done recently with Professor McCullough and Robert Malone have really been monumental in shifting public perception on an international scale. We're hoping to bring back Professor McCullough, by the way, and Professor Malone for the first time on the show in the near future. Professor Desmet will also be coming back. In fact, I was very delighted to see that Robert Malone kindly, before he was removed from Twitter, he kindly shared my interview with Professor Desmet, and in fact, during his conversation with Joe Rogan, also shared insights from that very interview as a key message within his conversation with Joe. So really delighted to see that that's had an impact. And it's my intention to actually, if I can, through the channels, reach Joe Rogan and introduce Professor Desmet to Joe Rogan, because I think, we've had well over 1 million views of our conversation with him now, but if Joe Rogan has the conversation, it's going to hit 40, 50 million plus, undoubtedly. So hoping to make an introduction. But these types of conversations help to shine a light on what has been happening and show the reason why things have happened in the way that they have. And Professor Desmet's interview itself shone a light on why people comply and why so many people remain attached to the narrative, and why so few question the narrative, and also the kind of 4 key precursors to the authoritarian regimes that we've seen unfold in the last 2 years, in the last 12 months in particular. So I don't want to dwell on 2021. I think we've all sick to death of everything that's gone before us. As I said, the clock ticked midnight last night and it hasn't all switched off and gone away. But the important thing for all of us is that we hold the pen to author our own destiny. And 2022 really is that opportunity to start to shift the narrative. I do believe we have a great opportunity to continue to sense make around this, all of the things in the world that make no sense. Which is certainly my goal here on the podcast. We want to really get to grips with probably some of the foundational material. Once again, some of the early questions that I was asking myself early in 2020, nearly 2 years ago now, because the people who are just starting to raise questions and starting to see what's going on are going to need to go through that journey. When we spoke to David Charalambos here on the podcast as part of the live footage in the recent protest in London, he'll be coming on the show shortly as well, and I'm sure that'll be an iconic interview, because we'll be talking again about the role of human behavior here and why people do what they do. But David speaks about the Wisdom Hotel, or the Truth Hotel, and that once we've kind of gone through, for myself personally speaking, for my own personal self, I've read, by the end of 2020, I've read thousands of articles, hundreds of data sets, scientific papers. It was an enormous amount of reading in order to educate myself, but also to prepare to launch this podcast, to making sure I had the most relevant and up-to-date information and facts to back up what was covering here. And like many, I'm sure you're the same, constantly seeking out information to understand the situation and make sense of the world. But having gone through that level of depth, when you talk to people who haven't been on that journey, we tend to go to the top of the Truth Hotel and start there. But actually, the reality is that there is layers upon layers upon layer of insights that culminate in that kind of broad stroke view of the situation that becomes clearer the more you seek. So it's important that we all understand that those people who are just beginning to question, and they are now, thankfully, lots of people are starting to question, because the people who've been double or triple jabbed right now, for instance, when there was a threat of the lockdown, they were up in arms saying, well, we've done our bit. They've been, effectively done what they've been told they need to do in order to have their freedoms back. We all knew that, those of us who have been skeptical for a while, I say the collective we, those of you who have been with us here on the Pandemic Podcast for a long time, we could see straight through that. But for others who hadn't yet seen that, that was a defining moment before Christmas where people started to think, what on earth is going on here? Allegedly, if these vaccines work, we're talking about lockdowns. 80% of the country has been double jabbed, at least those who are eligible. And a significant proportion, including the majority of those who are quote unquote most at risk, have been triple jabbed. So the threat of a lockdown, there's something that doesn't add up here. So it's these crazy behaviors that have started to lead people away from the narrative and poke holes or lift the lid of trust upon what has been encountered, what they've encountered, and that's happening more frequently on a daily basis. And as was spoken about by Professor Matthias Desmet himself in the interview, the crazier things get, the harder the authoritarians will push. And I sadly think going into 2022, we'll see that craziness ramp up. I mean, just countries that you would never expect. You know, the Australias, the Canadas, the New Zealands of the world have really gone down a really dark path. I mean, in Canada now, they are teetering on stage 7. If you've read about these 7 stages of genocide, I use that word. I don't use that word lightly, but if you read through the stages, they're teetering on the edge of stage 7, which is quite frankly shocking. What's even more shocking that the world is just witnessing it and seeing it happen. But now, now we can look at it from a lens of historic understanding. You can see why people are complicit. You can see why people comply. You can see why people become bystanders, and you can see how atrocities can unfold in the way that they have done in history, because of the very nature of human beings. And I'm an avid reader of philosophy. I really enjoy learning about the plight of mankind or humankind. And I've read philosophy books from thousands of years ago that simply lay out how human behavior have really not changed. Recently, there's a great book by Darren Brown, of all people, called Happy. I recently gave it to a friend of mine, but it's kind of a brief history. I mean, it's a thick book, but it's still a brief history of philosophy. And it simplifies all of the concepts. And you just see how human behavior just hasn't changed. We just live in an era now where technology makes the kind of behaviors amplify in a way, and the way things like we've witnessed happen in the last couple of years can happen at scale and fast, whereas previously they may have been limited by borders or geographic location. Now we live in such a technologically connected world that this and with the presence of social media in so many people's hands, this you can control how people think, feel, and behave at scale, quite frankly. And we could see that prior to the pandemic, let alone during the pandemic, where the control of information, with the egregious censorship, the deplatforming that we've witnessed. We've talked about Dr. Malone. He's been censored. One of the founding fathers, if you will, of the mRNA technology. He's, if you look at his history, look at his CV, the amount of energy he's invested and time and in his entire lifetime to developing vaccines. Saying he's the poster child, the poster man for the anti-vax movement is just ludicrous. It's ludicrous. You don't spend your entire career working on developing vaccines to then become an anti-vaxxer. That's just insane. So we've seen all of this ludicrous behavior, the censorship of the control of information, and all of this has happened at scale. We've seen, the censoring of any criticism of the vaccine or the vaccine rollout program. We've seen the smearing of those who are doing the criticizing. It's quite frankly it's a very interesting time to be alive. The benefit of this technological world that we live in is that the world has become a stage. The world has become a stage, and the corruption, the absurdity is being paraded on a stage on a global scale. And for those of us who can see it, you can see the depths of it. And that for me was my kind of, sadly, my waking thoughts this morning. Happy New Year, everyone. My waking thoughts was, my goodness, 2022, a new year. What will come of this year? And firstly, more than ever, committed to forging my own path, and without the influence of the government in my life, continue to do so. But also start to look at how we really do tackle these broad problems that have become really transparent in the last 2 years. And for many of you, I know have been looking at this for years prior to the pandemic. I certainly have had an interest for the last decade, particularly with the undue influence of big business, whether that's big pharma, big food, big agriculture, any of these big industries that have monopolistic type companies at the helm of the industry, you'll find corruption, conflicts of interests, public-private partnerships that influence government behavior. Um, so one of my guiding thoughts this morning was, how do we actually? I mean, because I've been narrowly focused on the issues surrounding the pandemic. More recently, in particular, the issues surrounding big pharma. At least privately, I haven't yet had the opportunity to share a lot of the things I've discovered yet on the podcast. It's finding a way to communicate it in a mainstream platform that enables us to do it without being shut down ourselves. Which is why in the new year now we will be also making sure we are, although we're currently on Odyssey, we'll be looking at other private platforms. We're actually going to be launching our own network, content network, so that we can actually post our content without fear of being smeared or censored in a private way. So watch this space on that. But we want to be able to, it strikes me how wide this goes, how deep and how wide this systemic corruption and this rot goes. And what we can witness, and what first, again, as always, began as a conspiracy theory around, for instance, the role of the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset. You can look at the history of the Great Reset. It's not a new concept that suddenly emerged within the scheme of the pandemic. It's Klaus Schwab and co have been speaking about this for several years prior to the pandemic. It's just given them the platform to elevate that conversation. But the plans are quite clear. The technocracy, the technocratic, authoritarian style world that we've become accustomed to, and we must not become accustomed to it, because you can look in other nations around the world, such as China, where once you allow this type of leadership in, it's very hard to remove it. Certainly, when you get to China's level, the only way that China will ever break free of the regime that they're under right now is through most likely civil revolution. So we can't allow it to get to that point, although we're on that trajectory at the moment. The reality is, with the World Economic Forum, they have been advocating for they have been a key component in the rise of public-private partnerships for the last 30, 40, 50 years, if not longer. However long that they've been in existence, this has been a key driver. Now, again, I don't, to be unbiased in some way, there is certainly a role for public-private partnerships. I'm not saying there's not. I'm not saying we should abolish any form of public sector cooperation or partnership with the private sector, and that's not what I'm saying. However, what we've witnessed is the greasing of the wheels of big business through politics to enable big business to prosper and profit at the expense of, in this case, my view is the public and society at large and humanity. But over time, the level of influence that big business has now garnered is insane. It's insane, and where governments were originally tasked with curtailing the growth of monopolies and to ensure competitive market behavior, that's all just diminished. I mean, I grew up hearing about the Monopolies Commission. I mean, just don't hear about it anymore. You don't hear about any antitrust cases, although there has been some with Facebook, but you don't see any material change, and you just see Facebook morph into this metaverse, a meta company, which is just moving away from the legal issues that they're facing as Facebook in many ways. But previously, governments were responsible for regulating industry and to ensuring this antitrust behavior, or this anti-competitive behavior was stamped out. But now now the governments are in the pockets of big business entirely, and there is no recourse. There is no recourse to any form of regulation that can be trusted in that environment where the financial flows and the power flows are in accordance with the interests of the big business that are supposed to be regulated by government. So we're in this trapped situation, and this was sadly my guiding thoughts this morning. I was thinking, well, if the role of the government historically has been to curb all of these things, but government is now bought by big business, then how do you escape this widespread complex of interest and corruption? if the very institutions that are supposed to represent the interests of the people, hence it's called the public sector, by the way, is absent, woefully absent. And this again is, we've witnessed it on a global stage through the pandemic over the last 2 years, but this is happening day in, day out, almost in every major industry, and the same is happening. The influence that the oligarchs have, the global elite, if you will, over governments, over the way the world is run, has reached a point where it's out of control, and the role of government is insignificant. So in many ways, what I've been campaigning, what most of us have been campaigning for in the scheme of things over the last 2 years, when it comes to public life and the level of intervention that governments have had over public life, our civil liberties, our human rights, our right to family life, our right to movement, our right to expression, many of these things are government overreach, where government is extending its power too strongly into public and citizen life. So on one hand, we've got governments that are now intervening heavily, or have been intervening heavily, into our lives. I still remember the day that I interviewed Beverly Turner, and she talked about how she felt like she was pushing the government out of her front door. And I really like that analogy, because it really does feel like that. But on the other hand, we've then got the complete underreach when it comes to regulating these major monopolies and the institutions that have essentially bought and captured governments. They are powerless against the global elite. So there's huge underreach, but there's also, and again, I was sat with a friend of mine who's a pharmacist, dear trusted friend. He studied medical ethics and law, following his degree in pharmacy. He's become a pharmacist for many years. And he was talking about all of these issues, and I was surprised to hear his experiences in this situation. But just talking about the level of influence that these companies have over policy, over regulation. And if you just look at just take the issue of vaccines alone, and I was shocked. I was naive to this, but when you look at the regulatory bodies that are supposedly independent, the regulatory bodies are government institutions that are funded by Big Pharma. Don't you see the problem there? The regulatory body is a government institution that is funded by Big Pharma. Instantly, there's a problem. And I remember when I discovered that, I asked the question, I put it on Twitter, and I only got like 20,000 followers on there, but there's lots of breadth of people there. I asked, is there a truly independent regulator monitoring any of these vaccines anywhere in the world? And it was like, I could, if you could hear tumbleweed on social media, you would have heard it. No one could give me an example of an independent body that is critically evaluating the efficacy and safety of the vaccines, that is truly independent, that is not in some way connected to government or Big Pharma. Now, that is a huge issue in my view, but it's just normal. It's just totally normal. The deeper you go, once you go beyond the surface level, as many of you know, the level of conflicts of interest and corruption with any of these big industries, whether it's Big Pharma or any other major industry, it's insane. It's insane. And the level of influence that these industries and companies and company leaders have over the way the world is run is profound. So it leaves us in a situation where the single institutions that are supposed to protect us from this type of behavior are essentially working. They're working for the oligarchs and the elite. Therefore, the public are left as the quote unquote victims in that situation, or could be, at least seen to be. But we have to remember the cycle. So the public are still what give the power. The public are those who give the power to governments. Now, it's easy for me to strike blame at the hand of the door of the government, and I think it's reasonable to do that. However, we, the public, if you look at the history of public engagement in politics over the last 20 to 30 years, it's just nosedived. I think I'll have to check the stats, but I believe less than 1% of the British population belong to a political party. Now, I feel completely politically homeless, quite frankly. I don't feel compelled to become a member of any of the parties. But in many ways, it may not even be legal for me to do this. But if it is, it possibly is. We should all become members of all the political parties, just so we can start to influence what is happening. Because whilst it's easy to uh, place blame at the door of the governments, and this is really, my observation and of a lot of activism and other areas, is it's placing too much focus on the role of government. We need to place that emphasis on the power that we have to influence change, as well as putting that influence on governments, because ultimately we elect the representatives. And whilst the system, don't get me started on the system, is broken and corrupt in its own right, and again, you change the leadership in a broken system, you get the same problem. Don't don't mistake the fact. I know I'm very aware of that, and we need to create real change and that real transformation. And I for one, am excited about looking at how we can transform the political system. But in the first instance, we have a responsibility to make sure that we hold governments to account to represent the interests of the people. And my view is that we have done a very poor job of doing that as citizens, but also within the institutions that have involvement with the government. The media historically have held governments to account. We've seen a complete absence of this in the last 2 years. Complete absence. But we've also seen a complete absence of industry. In fact, the unions, and I'm looking forward to bringing a guest on in the next few weeks who's going to speak about the role of the unions. A deep and profound. I mean, if you think Professor Desmond's interview at Mass Formation about how why people comply is one thing. If you start to look at the institutional involvement as another lever of why this is happening, answering the question, why is this happening? You'll see the unions have played a pivotal role in many of the policies that we've witnessed unfold. Yet some of these organizations would be the ones that are protecting worker rights. In this instance, we've seen the enablement of vaccine mandates in care homes, and now within hospitals and wider afield in other countries. So all of these institutions that are supposed to represent the interests of ordinary people are broken, and they're not representing us. So again, it's down to us to create that change, because again, all of these institutions are meant to represent us, but we are the ones that elect the representative individuals. And we are the ones that create these institutions. Now, if these institutions are failing us, then we must find ways to hold them to account. And one of the greatest discoveries I found before Christmas, and this was a new revelation to me, I sent a 10-point, those of you may have seen the episode, I sent a 10-point freedom of information request to my MP. He did respond at length, but he didn't respond to my freedom of information request. He basically responded telling me why he couldn't comply with my freedom of information request and how he was exempt as an MP from freedom of information requests. And I was like, aha, there's an opportunity. Thank you for flagging this to me in such a succinct way. You've actually given me the perfect evidence to say, now's the time that we create change there. That's a simple change that could create a level of accountability that we simply don't have right now. Why should MPs be exempt from freedom of information requests when they are supposed to be representing the interests of their people? So there's lots of things that we can start to do in 2022 to bring a greater level of accountability. Because don't get me wrong, we absolutely need to start thinking about how we reform, replace, and build new systems and structures. But we have to also be practical. You'll rarely catch me in realist mode because I'm hugely over-optimistic and ambitious. but systems and structures that can replace the current ones aren't going to be built in a day. We have to be aware of that. This is a long-term transformation that those of us who have been on this journey for the last couple of years, I am sure, are willing to place their focus and attention on building those new systems and structures. I, for one, am committed. I'm in. All my chips are in. It's game on. We have to find ways to transform these systems and actually create long-term systemic change, because otherwise we're just going to see the same thing on repeat. And amplified even further as technology emerges. But in the short term, we have to also look at what strategies we have available to us to hold these institutions to account so that the public interests are represented. And again, if there are no legitimate institutions out there that are putting restraints on the ability of big business and elites to influence government policy, then we have to create them. Ultimately, if you think about it, governments, if you go back in history, governments formed themselves. They weren't like a birthright of planet Earth. First there was the planet and then there was a government. It didn't work like that. Societies organized themselves and formed governments. So we have to also look at what organizations that can be created to begin to create greater regulation. And I'm a I have transformed in the last 2 years because I'm a classical entrepreneur who's in many ways a classical liberal. If you read political theory, classic liberalism is something that I find value in, uh, crossed with libertarianism in some ways. But the element of free market capitalism in itself has shown itself to be broken. And as someone who's spent the last decade in business, nearly a decade now, you would never have previously heard me saying we should be placing regulations on business because there's enough bureaucracy and red tape that make it difficult for businesses to prosper. However, when we now witness this level of the monopolistic influence over democracy and human life and society and the way the world is run, that's a totally different story. That's a very different story. That's a very different story to someone who wants to open a small boutique in a local town and has to go through the rigmarole of all these different rules and regulations in order to get started. That's very, very different. So there is, for someone who is a free market entrepreneur, I still believe in the value of the free market, but I also now see that we cannot allow these corporations and the wealthy elite to have the level of power and influence they do over society through governments. I think what does the future look like? What is the role of government going forward? It's on a slippery slope in many ways, a slippery slope that they don't realize that they're even on. So, in short, in the new year, I think there's a great opportunity for us to start to hold governments to account in a different way. And there's a really strong opportunity for us to start to build new institutions that begin to push back on the role of the global elite over the political system, creating new institutions that have new powers, self-granted powers, because again, it's all magical illusion. The power and influence that comes with government comes from the tacit agreement with the people. Similarly, again, if we create our own regulatory bodies over time, that is a similar tacit agreement that can be formed. But more exciting and more importantly, going into 2022, we have the real opportunity now to start to look at how we transform those systems and structures, how we build strong links in the communities that start to foster new behaviors and start to challenge the status quo, yes, but really start to build forward. Because believe me, now is the time for us to really get to come together. Firstly, because the walls are falling apart. The foundation is still strong, but the walls are falling apart on the situation, and we need to be there to pick up the pieces. We need to be there to pick up the pieces with, new institutions, whether that's healthcare, whether that's food production, whether it's new medical systems, whether it's new business systems, whether it's new political systems and structures. We need to be thinking forward now. If it takes time, it takes time. But now is the time to invest in the future. And I'm passionate about building new organizations that can make a difference. In fact, we're about to relaunch Elevate in the new year. Looking forward to launching Elevate. We're bringing a brand new community, starting with a brand new community to bring people together to actually explore these concepts of how we can create the future, reinvent the future of everything, but also how we can continue to resist the incumbent and what's happening and how we can drive greater accountability. But I want to be involved in building organizations that can uphold the values of freedom, democracy, and human rights, and to reprioritize and rebalance those as we go back to living our lives in the way that we did pre 2020. Not that I'm saying we should go back to the way life always was, because it's a function of everything we've witnessed is a function of the past. So it's time to draw a line, really turn the page, and start a new chapter, which is where I think the greatest opportunity lies for all of us to participate. Now, the key for that is for us to feel empowered. And to feel empowered, we must take agency and authority over the quality and direction of our own lives. And that begins with living it with what I call intentionality, and being very clear upon who we are as individuals, what we stand for, and the world that we wish to see and create. And I fully believe when we are empowered at an individual level, when we start to work together on a more collective basis, to build new systems and structures, institutions, to start to form new communities, then we can really create transformation. I entered 2020. I remember New Year's Eve 2019, waking up, going into 2020, incredibly excited. I thought this is going to be a decade of transformation and real change. Now, I didn't think it would start this way, and I didn't think this would be the catalyst. I didn't ever foresee that this would be the catalyst for that change. But believe me, whilst it's been 2 years of suffering and pain for many, myself included, uh, blah, there's no better way. I mean, couldn't even think of a word to say how, blimey. I'll put it politely. There's never been a way. There's never been a greater opportunity to create transformation. As I mentioned, this whole situation has put the corruption and the systematic failures on a global stage for all to see, and the world of technology has made it visible to almost everyone. And that for me creates the real conditions for lasting change, because when the problems become so bare and so apparent, then it becomes much easier to see the solution, and it switches many more people on to wanting to be part of the solution. So I'm very excited for this year. I'm very excited for 2022. The nonsense will continue, the absurdity will continue, but we'll drive ahead. We'll continue to sense make it on the podcast. We are going to be rebranding, won't be calling it the Pandemic Podcast for too much longer, but we're going to be making sense of the world that we're living in, the world that doesn't make sense, but also looking at solutions moving forward, creating inspiring conversations about how we can transform the world that we live in, and also looking at different modes of resistance, different modes of activism, so that we can continue to push back and create change. It's all of our responsibility to take action. I do believe once we're empowered and we have clarity of vision and a mission, then truly we become infinitely powerful. And I believe in the infinite power of the creative spirit of the human soul. And there is just an enormous opportunity for us. But what we must not get distracted by, was we want to understand how this has happened and why it's happened. Yes, we do. We need to make sense of that. If we get caught up in all of that web of what's gone before us, we lose sight of what we can do moving forward. So for me personally, this is our opportunity to take the power back, yes, but also to start driving a new path, start forging a new path. It's down to us to do that, and every one of us has a role to play. 10 years ago, when I left my career behind, I had no passion left. I was looking forward to finding my own path. And over the last 10 years, I've done lots of different things to kind of find my own trajectory. But this last 2 years has given me an enormous amount of mission and purpose, and helped me really understand the direction that I want to take my life. And I'm sure there's many people out there like myself who now feel compelled to be on the path to creating true transformation in the world around us and helping to rebuild society in the wake of the old. And for those of you who have that energy, I look forward to joining arms with you and helping to build that future, so that for ourselves and the young ones that are coming up, like my son Zach, who's coming up to 4 months this week, 4 months old, knowing that we're creating a better future for the generations to come. So on that note, I wish you good night, happy New Year. For those of you who are on that journey and are excited about building the future, I encourage you, please, to subscribe to our mailing list. It just takes 1 minute of your time. Go to danjgregory.com/pandemic, and to your name and email address, you'll join our mailing list, because we're going to be announcing the details of Elevate Network, which is our brand new private network, where we're going to be having the types of conversations we have here publicly on the podcast, but creating groups where we can help form local connections, build conversations around building the future, and start to look at how we can take more effective forms of activism and resistance in order to challenge what's happening, whilst keeping firmly focused on building a more empowering future. So you'll have the opportunity to join that new community very, very shortly. We're building the platform behind the scenes, and we need your support. So please do join the mailing list. If you'd like to help us financially to build that, we're expanding our team. You can go to danjgregory.com/supporter. If you become a monthly supporter, you will automatically be enrolled into one of our bundled plans within the network, which is really exciting for those who are going to join us inside of that community. It's just going to be mind-blowing what we're building behind the scenes. And please do come and join our Telegram channel if you haven't done so already. Just look us up at Pandemic Podcast UK. Stay connected to what we're doing. This is going to be a truly transformational year, and I invite you to be on the journey with us to help elevate humanity and enrich the world, because 2022 will be that transformational year, and every one of us has a role to play. So thank you so much for your attention this evening on this podcast. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for all your support over the last goodness me, nearly 2 years now on the podcast. Exciting times ahead. It's down to us to create the future. The power is in our hands. So happy New Year to you. Hope you had an amazing celebration over the New Year period, and I look forward to broadcasting even more in the next few weeks with the Pandemic podcast. All right, good night for now. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will see you very soon. Peace out.